But thank you all for coming. It's so great to see all your smiling faces so early in the morning. And I think you're going to have an excellent day, and hopefully I'll start it off with a little bit of an intriguing question, is will we all have green hair? But I'm going to hold off going on to that topic for a few minutes. But what I want to do is just position over the next half hour some concepts around food and our relationships with food and how complex that relationship can really be. But first I want to ask you some questions. What do you think of? What comes to mind when you just hear the word food? Sometimes if you're thinking about it, obviously this is an example of several screenshots of different food groups. You've got your fruits and veggies. You know you're all supposed to have your 8 servings of veggies a day and fruits and veggies a day. You've got your breads and cereal groups, your meat and dairy groups. But that's one concept when you think of food, is just the actual food sources. But maybe when you think of food, you're thinking about where you purchase your food, such as Sobeys. Or maybe you're thinking about how that food is prepared at home. Does everyone have a food plate that looks like that every evening? I would hazard to guess no, looking at what happens or what's been happening over changes in time. And that's one of the things I want to talk about today. Because sometimes we might be thinking about this is what you think about when you think of food, boxes of KD or Cheerios. Or maybe, as we see as increasingly what's happening, is a greater proportion of the food dollar being spent outside the home. So maybe what you're thinking about is Subway or Earl's or even the food court at St. Vital Mall. These are all things that may come to mind when you start thinking about your relationship with food. But the one thing that's really critical to understand is that relationship is complex. It's governed by a number of different factors. And if you start thinking about it, I'll show you some slides in a minute about how complex that can be. But first of all, you've got your individual preferences, what you like and what you don't like. How many people like Brussels sprouts? Yeah, there's not that many people. How many people know what Brussels sprouts are? Okay, well, that's a start. So there's individual preferences. But beyond the individual preferences, there's culture, there's familial effects of what's influencing your food choice. Then there's religious effects. For example, in the Orthodox faith within the Jewish culture, there's factors that can influence food choices from a religious perspective. Political stability. We are blessed to be living in a country that has a fairly, although some might call it, well, your perceptions may, I won't start going into political diatribe right now, but we are fairly blessed to have a very stable political government in Canada, so that we don't have to worry about wars and displaced populations. But we do have a very tough climate, and we're experiencing that today. We've had a very nice winter so far, but I think it's starting to catch up with us right now. So climate and geography can influence availability of food and the factors that can influence our food choices. And ultimately, other socioeconomic variables will influence those decisions as well. And demographics, or some of the characteristics of the population. And I'm going to talk about a few of these things as we work our way through this presentation. Now, this rather complicated slide really isn't that complicated when you start to break it down. This is the factors that are a model of the factors that influence food choices. So if you look at the little first blurb here, the first blob, this is you. This is the biologically determined behaviors. So this is the factors that come from you, so your genes. Also, what are your own personal preferences regarding taste and pleasure. And you start working as the individual at the inner part of that circle. So this is all your effect. Then you work your way out from that effect. And you start looking at your experiences with food. So for example, if you've been conditioned to hate Brussels sprouts because of the way your grandmother cooked them one time and you didn't like it, now you'll never touch a Brussels sprout again, that's conditioning. So that's basically a factor that's influenced your food choices. Beyond that, then you start getting into the factors that other people have on your relationship with food. So for example, if your friend is going, oh, why are you eating that? Oh, that's gross. Well, that's a peer effect that could potentially influence your food choice. And then beyond that, you get into the greater societal effects in your relationship with the environment. Food availability, if you're dealing with in areas where you're dealing with famine and drought. That's a physical or an environmental factor that's influencing availability of food and ultimately your food choice. But you've got the social environment, economic environment. But when I look at this slide, it reminds me of all of the different perspectives that have to come in to look at factors influencing food choices, and all of the different opportunities there are to study those factors. And that's when you start looking at why you're here, is to gain some experiences about what the kind of work that we do in the University of Manitoba and other institutions across Canada and the world. We start looking at those relationships. So for example, if you're looking at taste and pleasure, those are sensory factors. We have a foods lab over in our building where we can actually sit you down and look at what factors influence your taste preference for a specific food group. That's called sensory studies. Okay, so there's a lot of different opportunities to do research and study across the sciences and the social sciences involved in looking at factors influencing food choices. But what I want to do is just look at some examples. And for the purposes of this presentation, I pulled together some slides which you may or may not have seen before. But this is from a book called Hungry Planet. And this is a photo essay that actually appeared in the Time Life Photo Essays. But I just put together some slides to really sort of capture some of these factors that are influencing food availability and food choices. So what you're seeing here is the picture of a typical 1 week's food supply, and I'm going to show you a series of pictures. And what you're going to see, just to orient you, is the food in front of the family that they would typically consume in a 1 week period. And so and this gives you the region and also roughly the weekly budget that they spend on food. Now this happens to be a refugee camp in Chad, taking in refugees from the Darfur region. And so basically what you're looking at is through government assistance is basically a provision of the bare essentials to sustain human life. What are the factors that influence that? Well, it's political instability in the region and displaced populations. And so the goal here is to make sure that this family has the nourishment that they need to sustain themselves. So this is in Chad. Then you start moving into more developed cultures, and here we are in India. And certainly the budget reflects much greater, but I don't necessarily focus on the money right now, because what we're looking at here is a very well-to-do family in India, but this reflects the availability of the food that they have in front of them. Lots of fruits and vegetables. Culturally, the factors that are influencing their food choices are perhaps related to culture, religion, and you can see lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, water, rice, and so on. So that's in India. Then you start looking at Guatemala as an example. Again, looking at freshness, fresh fruits and vegetables, introduction of meat. So there's some eggs up here. I like to talk about eggs. As you heard, I do a little bit of research on eggs, so I'll talk a little bit more about eggs in just a minute. But then we start moving into more westernized cultures. So here we are, a typical family from Japan and what they would consume in a 1 week period. You start to see the introduction of more packaged foods. So I want you to start thinking about what goes into start packaging a food. What are all the things that we need to know about in order to present food in a packaged form? But then you start seeing introductions of more animal proteins as well, because certainly animal proteins are more expensive protein sources, and that can have a significant influence on the family's food budget. Here in France, of course, you're going to have wine, and, but also, again, a variety of food groups, bottled water, fruits and vegetables, and so on. But then you start looking at the North American pictures, and what do you recognize here first? What's the first thing that comes in mind? Sorry? Pizza, okay. What else do you see? Sorry? If you compare that to some of the earlier photos, what is the most striking example that you would see? Packaged foods, more processed foods. A greater proportion of the weekly food budget goes to more packaged types of foods. Now think about your own situation at home. And I'm not trying to lay any blame here or discuss any items. I just want you to think about your own relationship with food and your family's relationship with food. You start seeing more introductions of more packaged food, and this is a reflection of the factors that have influenced food choices over the years. And certainly this is the one Canadian family that showed up in the photo essay. And this happens to be a family from Nunavut. Very different challenges that we're dealing with in northern climates, because while this budget I was actually quite surprised to see this budget, because traditionally, when you're talking about northern food acquisition, where the food prices in the north can be extremely expensive. For example, a jug of milk can cost well over $12 for milk, and so it's expensive to eat healthily in the north, and that's one of the challenges that the northern regions have. But regardless, I think what you're seeing here is that for this particular family, definitely there's fresh fruits and vegetables, but a mixture of processed foods as well. So one of the things that we want to talk about is the changes in the food system over time. So if you think about the food system that in the past, this is some classic pictures of the past. So grandma with the kids on the farm and dealing with chickens. You're buying foods, in the city you're buying foods at a very small grocer. Typical family meals every night, having a great big roast turkey delivered under your table every night. I'm sure everyone's like that now. And this is what we talked about when we talk about processed foods, canning and preserving of pickles and fruits and vegetables that way. Compare that to what we're dealing with today. We have increased urbanization. Walmart here is one of the largest food retailers in the world. We're dealing with more of the food budget being eaten outside of the home and much more availability of packaged and processed foods. So what are some of the changes that we're dealing with? This is from some statistics. I always have trouble with that word, statistics, especially first thing in the morning. But this is Statistics Canada data from 2009. And what this is showing is changes in the on-farm population. Who can tell me what that graph is showing you? Yeah. Okay. So in 1931, bang on. 1931, roughly 35% of our population in Canada lived on a farm. Today, we're down to less than 5%. We're down around 3% of the Canadian population is actually farm. Just out of interest sake, how many people are tied to primary agriculture right now in the room? Okay. You're way more than the national average, primarily because there's some schools coming from outside of Winnipeg, and that's great. So you've got a tie to the primary production. You actually have a tie to where food is produced in Canada. But if you look at what's been happening over time, this graph basically shows you the number of farms on the left-hand side, and 800,000, it's this blue line. In the 1901, we had many, many small family farms, but starting in the 1930s, a dramatic reduction in the number of farms. The total number of acres or hectares farmed has basically remained flat. So what does this mean? Farms are getting bigger, less people on farms, farms are getting bigger. Why? There's a whole host of reasons why: increased mechanization, increased efficiencies of scale within agriculture, and able to be more productive on a smaller land base. But it's an increasing land base available that it can be managed with fewer people. So this has caused quite a ripple from a cultural standpoint, because the population is more and more removed from where food is being produced. If you ask somebody where milk comes from, they're going to say Sobeys, okay? They're not going to say Dairy Farm. They're going to say Sobeys or Safeway or Extra Foods. So this is a challenge that we're dealing with, is that we're further and further removed from our agricultural base. But the food industry is extremely important in Canada, and that's something that I need you to walk away with today. This is 2004 data. This is actually a report. This shows you how Statistics Canada works. This is 2004 data. It was a report that was released in 2009. But it gives you a reflection of what's happening. In 2004, over 800,000 people were employed in the total food sector. I thought it was more than that, but it's around 5% of the total population. And that includes primary production, secondary production or processing of that food to put it into packages, and also what's called tertiary production, or tertiary level, which is the food retail side. So the retail side, food service. So the total system represents 5% of the total population in Canada. But it contributed over $52 billion in economic activity. But this graph is showing you what's been happening over time is that as a percent of the economy, our food share has actually gone down. And so that's really a reflection that we're doing pretty well off in terms of of overall economic activity from our food costs. Now, because we're paying actually on a global perspective, Canadians are actually doing very well as a percentage of their overall budget, which goes to food, which means that we pay smaller amount of money than most other regions nationally. Now, food prices have gone up. You can argue that's not necessarily a good thing, because what percentage of the food budget actually goes back to the producers is a different argument altogether. But this just gives you a little bit of an overview of what's been happening to Canada over time. But I think what's important to say is that the Canadian food system is complex. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry when all sectors are considered. We've got thousands of new ingredients being introduced on an annual basis, new products, new processing technologies. But it's a system that produces confusing messages for consumers. You're all consumers. Everybody in this room is a consumer. You're going to hear talk of the consumption patterns a little bit later. But you're all consumers in this room. But there are mixed messages, and I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about those mixed messages as well. So with complexity comes challenges, but also opportunities. And I'll leave you with that at the end of this talk. You are not supposed to see this slide, okay? This is a plate of spaghetti for the most part, but what it represents is the global food system. It's meant to reflect, this slide is meant to reflect all of the interconnections that happens on a global perspective, the interrelatedness of the food industry, primary production, all the way through to consumers. And all of these little squiggles and lines is the interconnection. It's extremely complex. You have to be able to navigate that food system in order to understand the relationships and what that means from a country like Canada in terms of the health of Canadians, but also with respect to the social or the economic activity of this country. So from a food perspective, the first thing I want to ask you is, what is food? We can't really have a discussion about the food industry unless I ask you, what is food? So here's comic book guy pondering that question. Well, I'm going to go to the source of all knowledge in the world, which is Wikipedia. Okay, hopefully you've learned in class that once you read something on Wikipedia, if you don't like it, 20 minutes later, go back, I can change it, and you'll get the answer that you really want. It's still a good source, but be discriminative. Make sure that you discriminate when you're looking for information. Wikipedia is a good resource, but you should learn over time, and you'll learn that you need to check other sources of information. But I checked it, and I said, yeah, based on my experience, that's not a bad definition. It's a substance that, when consumed by a body, provides nutritional support. Okay? So when you talk about nutritional support, what we're really talking about are nutrients, the components that are found within food that support the physiological and biochemical process of your bodies in order to make sure that you can continue to thrive and survive and do the things that you want to be able to do. So what are the nutrients? Well, we've got protein, carbohydrates and fiber, fat, vitamins, minerals and trace elements, and water. We tend to forget that water is a nutrient, but it's extremely important, obviously, to survival. Now, from a perspective of the nutrients, we also have this category of dietary energy. And so the energy is basically the calories that you consume on a daily basis. And if you're looking at the components that make up your dietary energy, it's these three here: protein, carbohydrates, and fat. There is another category that adds calories, but you're far too young to know what that category is. It's alcohol. So we're just basically referring to the three that are primarily adding to the bulk of the caloric intake is your fats, carbohydrates, and protein. So here I'm showing my bias for eggs. This is a nutrition facts panel. This is something that you're getting more and more used to, hopefully, because they're found on almost all foods, with certain exceptions. It's a regulated process in Canada to have these nutrition facts panels on the foods that we supply. And this one is for an egg, okay? So this happens to show you the nutrition facts panel. And on the panel, there's a regulation to say we have to show the amount of calories, the amount of lipid, saturated fats, trans fats, cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrates, and proteins. These are the nutrients that we have to show you, as well as some vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin C, and so on. I put up this panel of an egg because I'm actually doing research, and I've got graduate students that are doing research looking at how do we influence the nutritional properties of an egg? So if I wanted to add more vitamin A to an egg, how would I do that? Well, one of the challenges is those eggs come encased in these darn little packages called shells. I can't just inject vitamin. Well, I could. There are technologies that you can inject eggs with substances, but that's primarily to give vaccines to the little chicks. But if you want to add nutrients to a shell egg, how could you do that? Any ideas? Yeah. Yeah, what are you feeding to the chicken? You can look at how the chicken actually deposits nutrients into the egg, because that's actually what their goal is. A laying hen is basically producing eggs. They're going to be the biological entity that modifies how nutrients are getting deposited in the egg. So if you added more vitamin A, perhaps you would increase the vitamin A content in the egg. That works for some nutrients. It doesn't work for all nutrients. We've done some work with folate, for example. It doesn't show up on your facts panel, but folic acid is a very important nutrient. But we can increase it, yes, but only to a point, and then the darn chicken won't add any more to the egg. She knows why she's doing that. There's biological mechanisms that regulate the nutrients and how they get moved from the diet and into the egg. And it's a very complex system, and so we're trying to tease out the genetics of the bird, the factors that influence how nutrients get processed, absorbed, transported through the blood, and deposited within the egg. And there's a lot of biological and physiological processes that influence that. So that's just a little aside to throw some research that we're doing into this process to talk about the nutrient facts panel. But I want to take this one step further and relate this to you. You're roughly what, 16, 17, 18? So let's look at some nutrient requirements for you. So what are your daily requirements? If I'm going to assume that you're 17 years of age, okay? So here are the energy requirements, and this is calories per day of males and females as reported in the what are called the dietary reference intakes, our handbooks that we use to estimate energy requirements for populations. So if I'm looking at males, they range between 2366 calories up to 3754 calories. Why do you think there's a difference between the low number and the high number? Assuming that this is a model person and they're the same weight and the same height. Yeah. Activity level. If you're sedentary and all you're doing is moving your fingers, playing your Xbox, you're probably down on the lower end. If you're running marathons, you're up at the higher end in terms of the amount of energy that you require on a daily basis. And so there's a grade, and knowing those factors, knowing how much activity that you do in a certain day is going to influence your energy requirement. For females, it goes from 1710 to 2871. Same factors there. Activity influences the caloric requirements, but there it's body frame and body mass that's basically determining the differences between males and females. And for protein, males 52 grams and females 46 grams. But what you can do with this nutrition facts panel is then relate, for example, one large egg gives you 70 calories. And you can say, well, if I need 1,700 and I'm getting 70 calories, I'm getting roughly only about 5% of my energy intake from an egg. Okay? But I'm getting 6 grams of protein, so I'm getting 10% or 12% of my protein requirements from one egg. So that's what those nutrition facts panels can do. If you're really interested in knowing more about what you eat and what's your activity level, the Health Canada, working together with what's called the Dietitians of Canada, and the profession of dietetics is a profession that you can actually go through if you study in human nutritional sciences. If you're looking at this is a website, and I'll see if this works. It was yesterday. Yeah. So it's eattracker.ca, and you can actually go there, set up your own accounts. You can follow your food intake, you can enter in your exercise and activity logs, and you can actually monitor your own performance within this website. It's a really great resource, and it's free. Well, it's free, but you paid for it because Health Canada paid for it. Well, your parents paid for it. But let's test your food literacy, okay? So I'm going to show you a few slides now, and it's a quiz. No, you're not getting graded for this. There's no marks at the end of the day. But I want to give you some examples to really test what's called your food literacy. What do you know about the foods that you're consuming on a daily basis? And the first one I want to start with has been in the news lately. It's Tim Hortons. Okay, Tim Hortons started by introducing the mega behemoth cup of coffee, the extra large. All they did was change the name and then add one really big cup of coffee at the end. Okay? But I want you to think about, as the size of that coffee increase, what's happening to the calories? What do you think is going to happen to the calories? It depends. It depends on how you drink your coffee. I won't ask how many kids are drinking, or how many students are drinking coffee in here, but your parents are probably drinking a lot of coffee. But if you look at the calories, if I'm looking at just a black coffee, nothing in it, or if I'm using an artificial sweetener, there's no calories in coffee. It's basically water and some bioactives and caffeine. Caffeine is the primary reason we drink coffee. But most people at Tim Hortons, if you ever go in there, the famous line is double-double. If you order a double-double coffee, an extra small has 110 calories. An extra large has 340 calories in it. So most people don't think about that. If you're consuming several coffees a day, there's actually potential for introducing a lot of calories if you're having double-doubles. And this is just the coffee, not to mention there are other beverages that you could be looking at. Now, if you're thinking, well, yeah, a couple hundred calories here or there is not going to make much difference. Well, maybe not at your age, but when you start getting a little older and your body starts slowing down a little bit, 100 calorie difference. If you're consuming 100 calories excess a day beyond what you need, over a month, that's 3,000 calories a month. That's 1 pound of body weight. So that's 12 pounds of body weight in a year, 60 pounds of body weight in 5 years. Okay? So that's something to think about, and that's just 100 calories. That's the difference between an extra small and a medium double-double. That just shows you how complex the system can be. And understanding the human body is really critical to getting to understand that relationship between healthy body weight and caloric intake. And it doesn't work for all people, okay? It's important to understand that bodies are really highly tuned. If you're weight stable for your entire life, that means that you're completely in sync with what's coming in and what's going out in terms of energy. But if you throw that off by 100 calories, over time, it can have an influence on body weight. But the issue here is portion size. So that's your first quiz. Okay, second quiz. Which of these foods has more fat per tablespoon? Who thinks butter? Who thinks margarine? Who thinks they're the same? All right. 2 people. Well, 2 people got it right. They're the same, okay? They're both oils. They both have the same caloric content. 11.5 grams of total fat per tablespoon and 100 calories. So butter versus margarine have the same amount of calories, same amount of fat per serving size. So they're exactly, because they're basically fat. But the issues, when you start looking at it, is butter has more saturated fat. Okay? That's a type of fat that is linked to increasing your bad cholesterol, your low-density lipoprotein cholesterol. So it has an effect on increasing your risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Now, margarine, the issue that you've been hearing in the news is about trans fats. These also have a really significant effect on risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And so margarine, the way you make margarine is basically to take vegetable oil and through a process called hydrogenation, you add hydrogen bonds across an unsaturated fatty acid to basically make a saturated fatty acid so that you've turned liquid vegetable oil into hard margarine. It's a process called hydrogenation. It's a chemical process. But that process introduces something called trans fat, which is an artifact. And it's really should be classified as a toxin because it has such a negative effect. Now, if you look at margarines today, the industry has responded very well to this because, and in fact, I don't know if you can see it, but this is non-hydrogenated. They found new ways to turn liquid vegetable oil into hard margarine by using stabilizers and thickening agents and algae extracts and things like carrageenan, which is an algae extract, and it makes a gel. So this is all food science that's coming in and having an influence relative to the food, primarily to promote health. So this is the last quiz I have. Sodium. Why are we interested in sodium? Sodium is linked to hypertension or high blood pressure. And so we want to try to keep an eye on sodium intake in the population because, by and large, the Canadian population is consuming excess amounts of sodium above requirements. So, who thinks the bread has more sodium? Okay, who thinks the bag of chips has more sodium? Okay. One slice of bread has 238 milligrams of sodium. One bag of chips. This is the little bag of chips. Sorry, I should have mentioned. This is a little bag of chips. Oh, okay, that changes everything, right? That's 226 milligrams of sodium. Now, this is the message from this slide is, please, I don't want you to take the message from this slide is that, okay, it's great to eat chips now. Okay, that's not the message here. The message here is, so the sodium that you're going to find in the bag of chips is added salt, sodium chloride, NaCl. They add the salt. Okay? The sodium that you find in processed foods like white bread, and this is commercial white bread that you get off the shelf that's stable and for some reason stays fresh for weeks on end. Well, the reason it stays fresh for weeks on end is because there are additives in there, and it's not necessarily salt, the NaCl, but it's the sodium that's found with other chemicals like sodium lactate and sodium stearate, sodium forms of other compounds which adds to the sodium content in these foods. And so processed foods, it's a real challenge for the industry to make low sodium foods because they've been using these sodium products for years and years and years. So it's something that we need to be aware of, is that there is a significant amount of sodium in processed food. It's not salt. So you have to walk away and think about the difference between salt and sodium. So one more challenge. Sorry, I did have one more challenge. Are these foods? Okay. Red Bull. To this day, I still have not had a Red Bull. I don't know what they taste like, but I should try one day. But are these foods? Okay. How many people think Red Bull is a food? Okay, you're starting to learn, right? You're getting wary of putting your hand up because I'm tricking you too much. But I'm trying to get you to think about the difference between what we put into our body, and now what I'm really trying to position is a difference between what the government or Health Canada calls foods. Okay? So Red Bull is actually not a food, but Coca-Cola is. Okay? The Fiber Plus bar that you get from Kellogg's is a food, but a protein bar, well, it depends on who makes it and about some of the processes that company had to go through. Flintstone's chewable vitamins, they're not a food. We still consume them, but they're supplements. And vitamin waters, maybe, maybe not. And the reason I'm saying maybe is because there's now something called the Natural Health Products Division from Health Canada. And these products, like the Power Bar and the vitamin water and the Flintstones chewable vitamins, are now called natural health products. So in the eyes of the federal government, they're not considered foods. They're more considered, they're actually closer to drugs than they are foods. But they're vehicles for introducing nutrients into the human population in a form that is similar to what we view as food. So it gets challenging. But this is introduced to this concept of functional foods and natural health products. And so now you're getting into linking science to the policy which governs how our food supply is moving. So you're here to learn about the future of food. So what I want to do is bring us back to the title, is will we all have green hair? Now, why am I asking this question? Well, the reason, it stems back to when I was in first-year university and I had a really crazy roommate who's now a brewer out in St. John's and doing very well, has a nice brew pub out there. But during first-year university, he was crazy. And there was one day we were having these deep philosophical conversations, and he said he wasn't hungry, didn't want to eat anymore. And then he said, you know, it would be great if I was photosynthetic. Basically, I didn't have to eat anymore. I could be like a plant and get all the nutrients I need from photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is basically a process of converting carbon dioxide and sunlight into carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So you don't have to rely on consuming food. You can just make your own food. Pretty far out idea. That would be going away. We'd have to get humans like this. Well, this guy probably is partying too much on St. Paddy's Day. But to get people to be photosynthetic, well, that's a talk for Dr. Hicks when he talks about genomics in a few minutes, in a little while. When he starts, sorry, he's not here. I'm pointing to where he would be. But Dr. Hicks is going to talk to you about genomics, changing the human genome. But before you think that's too far out there, this is an example of a higher-ordered organism called a sea slug. It's Lycia chlorotica. This is a higher-ordered organism that's actually photosynthetic. Okay? Now, it's been known for years that this organism had chlorophyll. Well, you can tell it's green. So they went and tried to figure out why it was green. They found it had chloroplasts, the little energy-producing parts of plant cells. It actually had chloroplasts, but the scientists thought that it just stole the chloroplasts from the algae that it ate. But just last year, they actually discovered that over time, this organism has evolved to steal the genes from the algae and incorporate it into its own genome, so it's actually producing its own chlorophyll. So this is truly a photosynthetic organism. Okay, so it's not that far out there. But maybe this is your idea of the future of food. Stem cell burgers. So what's a stem cell burger? Well, this is, again, fairly recent research. But stem cells are progenitor cells that can grow into any cell types within the body. And in this particular case, what researchers have done in the Netherlands is taken those stem cells and made muscle cells. And burgers are made from muscle. They're muscle of cows or whatever other type of meat that you want to find in your hamburgers. But if you're looking at bovine muscle, it starts originally as a cell, as a myocyte, basically a muscle cell. But you can actually make stem cells in culture. So you can create muscle in a petri dish. It's called cultured meat or in vitro meat. And this is actually coming. It's not going to look like this, okay? It's not going to be a burger in an Erlenmeyer flask. It actually looks more like this. Not very appetizing, I can tell you. But there's actually a chef in BC that has been promised that he will be able to make the first stem cell burger, and they estimate the cost of that burger will be about $300,000 per burger. Are we ready for that yet? I don't think so. But it's coming. This is the type of work. And there's others working in this area to look at cell culture as a means of generating, in particular, protein. Or maybe this is your idea of food. With all the apocalypse movies out there and zombies, maybe this is what's going to happen to us in 40 years. We'll all turn out to be zombies and we'll be eating brains. But what I want to do is talk about some food trends. And this is food trends to 2020. So I'm not going all the way to 2040, but I'm going to 2020 because this is from a report that's been published by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So what are some of the top food trends that were envisioned in about 6 years ago? And we can look at what some of them are. Aging Canadians. This is a true effect. We've got the baby boomer population. So your parents, anybody 1 year older than me is a baby boomer. So it's basically a bulge in the population as a result of the influx of people that were born after the Second World War in Canada. And they're having a tremendous impact on what's happening in Canada from a political perspective and from an economic perspective. They're buying a lot of the cottages right now. They're buying a lot of the high-end merchandise. They're producing a lot of kids. But we also are going to have in the future a very large, older population because the healthcare system is making sure these people can live longer and live more active lives. And our pension systems are going to be challenged. We're already hearing that in the news right now about the sustainability of our pension system. But the boomer effect is going to be a tremendous influence on the Canadian population. So, for example, how we open jars in the future. Right now, if you're looking at a couple in their 80s and they want to make pasta, how do you open a jar when you're 80 years old? What's a device that can help you open a jar? What about adding more functional ingredients to those pasta sauces, making a functional food, a food that has more fiber or more bioactives to keep you healthy longer? The boomer effect is a real effect, and it's having an influence on our food system now. We have an evolving society. Household sizes are getting smaller. We're more environmentally aware. So we're spending more attention about where food is coming from. We have changing meal patterns. Cooking, what's that? Okay. I think this is a real challenge right now with some of the skills that we've taught in the past are not necessarily being transferred to today's generation, and that's influencing how meal patterns are going to shift over time. Shifting expenditures, more of our money being spent outside the home, buying takeaway meals from Sobeys, to buying more food from the food courts and so on. Food for health, looking at foods that can maintain healthy body weight, looking at 10 years ago, it was the Atkins craze, all the high-protein foods that came out to try to influence body weight. The educated consumer. Consumers are being more conscious of food labels. They're reading these food labels. They're demanding foods that can help them be healthier and live longer, productive lives. We also have what's called the new face of Canada. So more diversification as we welcome new immigrants into our province and into our country. That's having an effect on our food supply. We're seeing more and more variety in the stores. And some foods, you might be walking down the food aisle and saying, well, what is that? I've never seen that before. I mean, you may not even recognize it as food. But it's foreign to you because from a cultural perspective, you've never experienced it. But that's the face of a new Canada. It's fusion cuisine, new diversification, new food groups coming in. But consumers don't want to trade off convenience. They want a balance between taste, quality, and nutrition. So they want it all. You guys want it all. You're the I want it all generation. You want it to taste good, you want it to be cheap, you want it to be convenient, and so on. Finally, veggies, anyone? You're seeing an increased consumption of meatless meals. Certainly more soy products on the marketplace right now, and not just tofu, but you're seeing soy showing up in a lot of different forms. Meatless ground meat substitute products that can be used in a lot of different products. Increased consumption of pulses or beans and peas. Also organic foods, increased production and availability of organic foods. We just had an organic food conference here on campus just a couple of days ago. Small indulgences, you still want your high quality gourmet foods. And finally, and probably this is the one that's probably going to have a significant influence on a lot of the food choices, is our awareness around food safety and the production practices that we use in order to produce our food. What are if we're looking at the use of inputs from an agricultural production standpoint, the way in which we raise our animals. For example, if I bring my experience back to eggs, there's been a shift in the way that consumers are looking at egg production. They want to see environments for laying hens that better meet their needs from a welfare standpoint. GMO, genetically modified organisms, looking at fish that have certain genes added to them to increase productivity. You're looking at vegetables that have genes spliced into them to enhance freshness and so on. So I'll just finish up by bringing this back to this food model, this cultural model slide, which is basically, again, going back from the individual, where there's a discussion of taste and pleasure and hunger and satiety, really understanding the factors that influence individual decisions. These are physiological mechanisms, behavioral mechanisms. We need to understand those factors. There needs to be research to understand why individuals like certain foods and why they don't like certain foods. Once that research is completed, it needs to be translated so that companies can respond to those preferences. Because you can make the healthiest product in the world, but if it doesn't taste good, it's going to sit on the shelf and gather dust. So you need to understand that. So translating that knowledge of what influences food taste is going to influence the development of food products. Experience with food, understanding these factors, conditioning, why we our experience with food and how that influences the individual responses. And then the influence of society and your peers and how those ultimately influence food choices. So it's extremely complex, lots of different parts, lots of need for study and for research, lots of need for bright young minds to enter into this area, to conduct this type of research, to study the type of work that that we do here at the University of Manitoba. Because ultimately what this complexity does, as I showed you earlier with how much economic activity there is in Canada, what this complexity does is create jobs. Okay, it creates jobs for you in the research area, it creates jobs for you in the food care system with your knowledge of how nutrition and the food supply and the changes that can occur can ultimately influence the health of Canadians and maintain strong economic activity. So with that, I'm going to finish up, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have. And I've lulled you all asleep. Yes?
Can you give us information on your study on eggs?
Oh, sure, yeah. We got a couple of different studies. One is on water-soluble vitamins, so in particular folic acid. This is a water-soluble vitamin, and it's linked to healthy cells, but in particular in the late 90s, it was mandated that foods should have more folic acid added to them, and primarily that was to decrease the number of babies that were born with what's called spina bifida. It's a neural tube defect, and it can be, and folate supply is linked to that. So one of the things that we were looking at doing is how do we make sure that folate is available in a variety of foods naturally? And so one of the food groups that we looked at was the egg. And so this is where I have a background in animal science. I also have a background in human nutrition. And so I put those two together. Actually, when I started, this is a little bit of life lesson for you. When I started university, I had a fixed goal. I had laser focus. I'm going to be a vet. I'm going to be a veterinarian. Laser focus. Nothing could deviate me from that path. Well, the veterinary, when I went to do my interview and the exams, they said, we don't want you. So that deviated me from that path. So that laser focus, regardless of what I wanted, they didn't necessarily want me. So that's what you need to keep in mind, is that life is full of options. Don't discount opportunities when you see them. So the opportunity came for me to study other factors. I took an interest in research. I worked as a research assistant in lab and started doing work with animal feeding, and discovered that, you know, you can really look at factors that influence not only the health of the animal, but if you're looking at animal products, the foods that we consume, like milk and eggs and meat, what we feed those animals can influence the quality of the food that the consumers are actually eating. So folate was one example that we've done. The other one that you may have been seeing already on the store shelves is omega-3 enriched eggs. So we're looking at factors, what does the feeding of the laying hen influence the types of omega-3 fatty acids that you find in eggs, because they're not all the same. And so that's some of the research that we're currently doing, looking not only at the feeding studies. So we've got studies right now where I'm feeding the hemp seed to laying hens. We're increasing the omega-3 content in the eggs. Some of those eggs are being evaluated for sensory quality, how they taste, how they look. Because certainly the way that you feed chickens will influence the color of the egg yolk. When I first moved to Manitoba, I was really surprised eggs were really pale. And that's primarily because they're wheat-based diets that we feed the chickens. But whereas in Ontario, where I grew up, was a lot of corn being fed, and so much orange or darker colored yolks. So the diet can really influence the quality. And some people don't like that pale color, and some people think the dark yolk isn't what they're used to, because it's culturally what they grew up with, is what they're used to. So we've gone all the way from the feeding studies to look at the nutrient content. We're actually running clinical studies at St. Boniface Research Hospital, looking at the effect of omega-3 fatty acids on how this can, excuse me, on how it can influence the health outcomes of patients with peripheral arterial disease as well. So it sort of runs the spectrum, all the way from feeding the chickens up to human clinical studies. So lots of opportunities for science, lots of opportunities for research, and to interact and use your interests to create those opportunities for yourself. So, yes? Okay, you said you did free range? Okay. Okay, so they were in the yard? Okay. Chickens are foragers, so just like cattle. They'll go around and they'll eat grass. Grass is green, but what's underneath that green is the green is the chlorophyll. But what's underneath that green is also a lot of what's called carotenoids, and these are compounds which are intensely orange colored. You just don't see them when you look at grass because grass is green and that color is masked by all that chlorophyll, that green color. But they also contain all these intense orange pigments. So when chickens are consuming grass, all those orange pigments are being deposited in the egg yolk, and so you get that intense colored yolk. You also get all the beautiful flavors from all the bugs they're eating too as they get added to the egg yolk. So why we get pale yolks is primarily because we feed diets that have less of these carotenoids. And things like wheat and barley will typically have that type of effect on diet. So if you made a diet that is primarily wheat or barley based with no corn or any of these other carotenoids, you'll get a pale yolk. Yes? That's a great question. I think if you looked at the history of nutrition, the most dietitians will say eat a variety of foods so that you can prevent yourself from nutrient deficiencies. The history of nutrition is really a history of preventing, first, is a history of preventing nutrient deficiencies, things like scurvy and rickets. We don't have a lot of scurvy and rickets in Canada anymore. There's still populations, and you can still get it, but we understand how to prevent that. So in Canada, in the westernized and developed countries, it's not really a question of nutrient deficiency so much as now the attention is being played on how do the food that we eat now at your age or even younger influencing health outcomes later on. So I think what's at the heart of your question is there a perfect food? Should there be just one food that we consume all the time that has all of our nutrients in it? Well, that would be boring, for one thing. I think having a variety of foods increases enjoyment. It goes back to the factors here that influence why you want to consume foods. Taste, pleasure, all these mechanisms that are really affecting the way in which you consume food. Imagine if you're having Christmas dinner and the whole family's or whatever cultural dinner that you're going to have, and the whole family's gathered around a Protein Complex 101 that's sitting in a bar form in the table, and they're just taking a slice of Protein Complex 101 as the sole supply of nutrients to you. That's not a very appealing concept for me. Maybe if I'm going to space and I need to make sure that I can take nutrients with me in space. It's actually a really interesting area if you're looking at space nutrition. Fascinating area to get into. Actually, I had, sorry, this is a little bit of an aside for the discussion, but when you're in space, you think about these little products of what they showed you in the 1960s of toothpaste-type tubes that you suck on to get your nutrients from. Well, that's one way, but actually, my sister-in-law's brother is an astronaut, and he was up on the space station for just over 23 days and did several spacewalks. And so I asked him, what was he eating up there? And he said, tortillas, ice cream, oranges. I went, really? And he showed me pictures of oranges floating through the space station. So it's a variety of foods. Now, to get to that point, you need to realize that there had to be a lot of study as to what are the risks for doing that. The main reason we have what are called HACCP programs, or programs to ensure food safety, it really came out of the space age in the 1960s to ensure that when astronauts went up into space, they didn't get sick by eating a food that was contaminated. Because there's not much you can do to an astronaut if they get food poisoning up in space. So I think the long answer to your very short question is that a variety of foods is the best. Where there's opportunities to look at foods that might enhance the intake of certain nutrients, great. But I think one of the things that we're going to be paying more attention to is this question of, is there such a thing as too much? And it's not just calories. It can be other nutrients, like even the water-soluble vitamins. There's some question about, are we getting too much of some of these vitamins? Okay, so it's a good question. It needs lots of research. You need bright young minds to come in and do that type of work. Okay.